City University Television presents the American Theater Wing Seminars. Working in the theater. This seminar, production.
Welcome to the American Theater Wing's Working in the Theater Seminars, coming to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Created by Isabel Stevenson, these seminars are now in their 31st year, giving us an opportunity to learn from the professionals as they share their experiences in working in the theater. Today's seminar is on world theater. Our panelists are artists who provide the creative heart of the theater, and will learn just what they do and discover how the magic of theater is created worldwide. I'm Roy Somlio, president of the American Theater Wing. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the seminar, founder of the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, executive director of the Johnny Mercer Foundation, and longtime friend of the American Theater Wing, George White.
Thank you, Roy. It's a great pleasure to be surrounded by these global luminaries, as I may say. And I would like to start by introducing our panel today. On my right, far right, is, which is not a political statement, I must say. On my far right is representing, I guess, Ireland. Wouldn't you say would be the best?
Maybe those islands. Maybe.
The islands, okay. The islands, the northern islands. Fiona Shaw, who is currently represented on Broadway by Medea. And next to her is a gentleman from the People's Republic of China, Mr. Shu Xiao. And on my immediate right is Marita Gochman, who is Swedish, but also, let us say, represents Nordic theater. So that she covers a large part of the northern hemisphere that way.
Just five.
Five, just five. Five, no, okay, there we are. My immediate left is Elise Thoron, who is from this country, but is a citizen of the world and has worked in theater in Russia, in Ireland, and a great deal of time, spent a lot of time in Holland and Amsterdam. And on her immediate left is Valery Fokin, who is from the Meyerhold Center in Moscow, representing the Russia, if you will. And on his immediate left is Anatoly Smeliansky, also from, well, we say the Russian Federation. That'll sound like two different places, but anyway. So that is our distinguished panel today. I must say that our two friends from Russia are appearing here thanks to the generosity and courtesy of Fordham University, the Trust for Mutual Understanding, and the New York State Council on the Arts, for which we're very grateful for their help and support. I think I'd like to start, if I may. Fiona, starting with you. There's much we will and should talk about, but perhaps we should begin by pointing out, I mean, since you have worked in the islands, including Australia, which is a very large island, but how the similarities and differences, and perhaps we could begin by talking about training a little bit, because I know that although in many, many cases here, and we have the leading, perhaps, authority on Stanislavski in the world, Mr. Smeliansky, but not all of us are children of Stanislavski or trained that way, and perhaps you could begin this way. We'll go from there.
Well, the training is probably connected to what you began with, which is what are the differences or similarities between world theatre, and I suppose all theatre is the live display of the preoccupations of the psyche of that country. That's its aspiration. It very rarely is that, of course, because it immediately gets hijacked either by politics or by training or by commerce. So, you know, you might say in America the preoccupations of the theatre are about financial and political success versus the nature of emotional failure in the family. So you produce the most extraordinary family dramas where everybody is becoming president, but somehow there's a catastrophe in the middle. And Russia, of course, has given us this remarkable investigation into the universality of the way in which somebody moves a coffee cup, how in a gesture the entire world changes depending on the intention. I have no idea what China gives us, but in terms of training, I just know that the great schools of training that have survived into the 21st century, and very little has survived, the theatre is in a very difficult place, is when it is underpinned by the will of a government. And for that you do need time, you need terribly good teachers, and you need a notion of scholarships or endowment. If training is purely financially based, then you only have the children of often the privileged upper classes being trained, and so the theatre only has those preoccupations. The best training is when everybody in the community has an opportunity to be trained if they wish to be.
Great. Since you brought up China, Mr. Xiao, if I may, tell us what you feel that, for instance, the role of the theatre is now in China as it is evolving so quickly. I know a few years ago one of the most controversial dramas was Red Skirts Are Popular in the Streets, and that was quite some time ago. But now, what is the role? How is theatre, is it growing in China? I know you're doing musicals now that were not done before, but tell us a little bit about how that's working.
Okay. And Chinese people take the theaters in a much broader sense. It used to, it focuses everything, it encompasses everything together. Say, for instance, the musicals, the drama, they have a local kind of operas which is called qu yi, and also xi qu. Xi qu means it's hard to translate. Something like operas, grand operas, or local operas. It depends on the dialects. We have different kinds of dialects, quite vary. And also they have a qu yi. It's more like a storytelling or with a little bit singing, talking, that kind of thing. So it did take it into a very a broad senses, and it dates back a long history, say 900 years ago. So it has developed kind of more entertaining than, as well as educating a tool, also a kind of art form. So the people nowadays even enjoy a wider scope of theaters nowadays. They imported kind of say art forms from outside, like the drama, the play, which is quite modern to the Chinese, because when the Asian theater form is singing, dancing, and storytelling put together. So purely just speaking, telling a play is something new for the Chinese, although it has probably 80 years old.
Well, that was in the 20s where it was really first began.
1920s, yes, that's right.
So you really have the traditional opera and the traditional kind of entertainment, and also the, well, I don't know if you want to say Western drama, but spoken drama that has evolved since the 20s.
Yeah, that's right. And also, like the musicals, American musicals, many Chinese love that kind of things, and also some other theater forms. So now we have a mixture of both modern and ancient, both traditional and the new creations, so both in form and in contents, which for the Chinese people, they think that they need that kind of many.
Right. Wonderful. Marita, in terms of Nordic theater,
yes,
but also, I mean, there's of course a great long tradition there. What would you say? You would take any country of the five you're talking about, but and of course I know you've been working a great deal with Lars Norén, who is probably I would think the greatest living Swedish playwright.
That's right.
Today, and a powerhouse over there, virtually unknown in this country.
Exactly.
What would you say the role of the theater, starting in Sweden and then also in the Nordic countries, would be, other than obviously beyond entertainment.
Well, I wanted to pick up on training.
Good.
I mean, I think we have to train audiences, and I think that was understood in the Nordic countries early. We started early in the school system to bring good theater to the kids. We have good playwrights writing for children way from 3 years and then going up. I think that is where do you draw the audiences otherwise? So training for audiences is one thing. And
How do you do that? Just jump in here for a moment.
How do you do it?
How do you train kids?
You bring them in to see wonderful things. You bring them in to see the great actors and actresses with doing good plays about important issues that, but on their level, and they get hooked. You know, they want to go back. Training in the theater is very serious in all the Nordic countries, and that is a whole other issue. But thousands of people try to get into the royal schools, for instance, and 2 or 3 are accepted every year. So there are private schools and there are coaches, but very, very different from the American system in theater training.
And getting into the theater school is not dependent on your amount of money you or your parents have, is that?
Oh, no. Once, if you are in, it's paid for. That education is paid for. You do not pay for that. And it's a 3 to 5 year education, and when you end up, you usually have a job.
That's
That's the idea.
Very different from that. Yeah.
That's the whole idea.
Which is why it's so selective and there are so few.
Right, exactly. They don't want to have too many highly trained actors because they want them to work.
Waiting on table at the
That's
Grand
right,
Hotel.
or driving cabs.
Right.
So that's...
Well, that's I don't necessarily go around. If anyone wants to add to this, leap in. But I wanted to ask Elise, since you have you are American, but you've worked in so many different cultures, and you've been in China, and you've been in Russia, and Ireland, and Amsterdam, and England. From an American perspective, would you like to, give us your feeling about your view of the different, how you've been affected, or how you've seen, from your point of view, these different kinds of cultures, the theater cultures, if you will?
In one sense, they're radically different in their means of training and means of working, and what an actor will bring with them as a way of working on a role. I think the most startling experience I had was in Dublin, working with an Irish actress named Olin Fuers and a no master, Akira San. And my stereotypical conception was that the no master was going to be very abstract in his approach. This was all about playing the role of Georgia O'Keeffe, and that the Irish actress was going to be much more coming from the tradition of Stanislavski or something that I was familiar with. And it turned out to be completely the opposite, in that the no master was much more interested in biographical specificities, in actually taking on the challenge of playing this character of O'Keeffe. And he was doing it in mask, and he was doing it in no form. And that Olin said to me, I will never play O'Keeffe. We're going to have to come up with a completely abstract approach for my playing another person. And so that one's kind of preconceptions are also toppled in the most delicious way in working in a cross-cultural setting, which is why I think I keep doing it again and again, is that you realize that it is very much about individuals, and that you cannot kind of walk into a room and have any assumptions whatsoever. So I offer that.
Tolia and Valery, well, we go together.
He's first.
Yes,
He's Meyerhold, he's Avantgarde, I'm Stanislavski.
That's right. All three of you are two people.
Okay.
I have seen, and you know, because you've lived through it, the change large change in the role, perhaps, of theater in Russia since 1991-92. Well, we can talk about a couple of things. First of all, the training has remained pretty much the same, and you've had a great deal, I know, to do with training, both of you. Perhaps you could talk about that and how the roles of theater in the last, let's say, 12 years have changed in Russia. Either of you can talk about that.
Stanislavski был первый. Stanislavski is the first.
Stanislavski is the first.
Yeah.
I will answer on the first half of the question, not about training, because probably Valery would answer about the training and what happened with the training. Nothing happened with the training. But with the place of the theater in the country, of course, a lot of things are happened because there is no country called Soviet Union. There is no theater called Soviet theater. There is no many things which we grow up there. So what's the place? To make the story short, that guy, in '87, he was artistic director of Yermolov's Theatre, just across the Tverskaya Street, former Gorky Street, also great change in Russian life, and Moscow Art Theatre, and across the street is the Yermolov's Theatre. And Valery was one of the first who did a show, very famous that time in '87, called Speak Up. And then, in the same building where Valery was working that time, on the first floor, it was the first cooperative restaurant in Moscow. After that famous show, they also called them Speak Up. It was a time of Speak Up. In that way we started. Now, if you see the same building, Yermolov's Theatre, on the same floor, it's in the same place is a restaurant called Mexican food, La Cantina. And if you would like to ask me what's the historical distance between what was in Soviet Union and what we have now, it's the distance between Speak Up and La Cantina. You understand?
Yes.
Then Valery will talk about the professional things, which really what happened with the training, with the theater, with the understanding of theater, which is the most important thing.
Переведешь?
Да.
Мне кажется, что вопрос тренинга — это вообще очень сложный вопрос.
The question of training is a very complex question.
Дело в том, что очень много разных последователей в разных странах, в том числе и в России, которые пытаются говорить о Мейерхольде, тренироваться как Мейерхольд или как Станиславский.
There are many followers of in all countries, in Russia as well, of Meyerhold and Stanislavski people who are trying to train like Meyerhold, train like Stanislavski.
И, как правило, это не имеет никакого серьезного отношения к тому, что вообще на самом деле есть.
And on the whole, it has no relationship to what the reality of Meyerhold and Stanislavski are.
А потом, как определить, имеет это отношение или нет?
And how can you decide whether this has any relationship to the original source
Ведь
or
в
not?
конце концов нельзя им позвонить по внутреннему телефону и
You can't
узнать
call
их
in
мнение.
an internal telephone and
Very long
ask.
distance.
Вы понимаете, имя Мейерхольда сегодня очень модное.
Meyerhold is a very fashionable name right now.
Я приезжаю, например, в Испанию, в Севилью.
I go to Spain, to Seville.
Мне говорят, немедленно идемте, вот тут в студии, они работают биомеханикой.
Come to our studio, we're working with
Я
biomechanics,
прихожу
please.
и вижу, как
And I come and see,
15 испанцев бегают по кругу вот так вот,
and I
3
see
часа.
15 Spanish actors running in a circle for 3 hours.
И мне говорят, вот, ты видишь, вот это
And they
биомеханика.
say, look, you see, this is biomechanics.
Я говорю, ну, наверное,
And I say,
это
yes.
для того, чтобы себя разогреть, это
It's good to
неплохая.
warm up.
Конечно, это очень вульгарный пример,
That's a very vulgar example,
но это правда.
but it's true.
Поэтому я думаю, что вообще тренинг — это тренинги должны быть разные.
So I think that training should be very diverse.
И они должны, каждый тренинг должен иметь отношение к тому спектаклю, который ты делаешь в данный момент.
And each training should relate to the production or the work that you're doing in that moment.
Спектакль рождает потребность в том или ином тренинге.
So that the production gives birth to the need of training.
Нельзя Станиславским открывать каждую пьесу.
So you
Это
can't
абсурд.
open each play with Stanislavski. That's absurd.
Don't touch Stanislavski.
Да, в театре,
Не трогай Станиславский.
ну, Мейерхольд.
Oh, we can say the same thing about Meyerhold.
Театр тем прекрасен, что там много дверей
What's wonderful about theater is that there are many doors
и много дорог.
and many roads.
И поэтому интересно всегда, когда эти дороги пересекаются.
So what's interesting is when these roads cross.
И поэтому сказать, вот этот тренинг лучший в мире, я так не могу.
So to say this training is better, is best in the world, I can't do that.
Can I add something to what Valery
Please.
said about the training? Probably it would be good for other people to pick it up. A couple of days ago, I had an experience back in Cambridge, where I'm teaching at ART with the students, and I was honored to be part of the rehearsal of Anne Bogart, which is she's doing there now the Le Dispute Marivaux in ART, and the students of the institute is there in the show, and every rehearsal she starts with the warming up stuff, and she's using, as you probably know, a Tadashi Suzuki technique, because he is a co-founder of their theater with Anne, and she uses also the viewpoint technique. And the students, then we had a class after the rehearsal, and I did ask the students, guys, how do you understand why and what are you doing when you are stamping in a manner of Tadashi Suzuki like that? You didn't ask me to do it, but about the microphone, but sorry. I will not get it, on my breast. Because of Stanislavski, who said, why did I ask them? Because Stanislavski had a very strange meaning about the physical training of an actor, which is, everybody knows that physical training is so important, so important. But that guy, who was very religious, by the way, and this is the ground of the whole stuff, of the ideal theater, of the ideal school, of the ideal actor, and everything. The ground is the religion for him. And he converted the religious ideas into something, Moscow art ideal theater, And he had a very strange meaning about the physical exercises and so on. And once he said, all of the physical exercises and development of the physical body of an actor harmful if it has not a spiritual task. Don't do it. It would ruin you. Any kind of physical training without spiritual task. It was a question about how to use, now we have a global stuff. We can go to Japan, we can go to Ireland, we can go everywhere to learn, to study, and to use it. We can combine viewpoint, Suzuki, Valery Fokin together with Stanislavski. But the point is, he's absolutely right. What's the ideal? What's the spiritual goal of any kind of training? And we lost it because Stanislavski was afraid of that. When he started so-called American word method, he never used the method system. I don't know, you converted it into method. And when he started doing the method in 1906, he had a nightmare about the future of the method, which actually happened here, and in Russia, of course. The nightmare was about, he saw in his dream a class of students sitting there, and very well-shaved teacher, it's a metaphor of a mediocre, very well-shaved, for Stanislavski, not for me, I am very well-shaved. Very well-shaved teacher is asking one of the students, Mr. Ivanov, Ivanov is the most popular Russian last name, Ivanov, tell me about the method and the organic, elements of acting. Ivanov stand up and started, something, saying about method and acting and so on, and that the nightmare. He waked up and started screaming and crying, stop it. Throw out all of my books which I wrote. Don't allow, I panicked enough. It's in a night dream. Don't allow mediocre teachers to take advantage of my mistake. I panicked enough. Throw out all of my books. It's a night dream, but it came true. Here also in the States, I talked to Anne Bogart. She is, in her book, Director Prepares, she is talking a lot about what happened with Stanislavski here. How did he affect American theater in the wrong way? How did they use Stanislavski in the Soviet Union to kill the new art, and so on and so on. We have to understand it. We have to admit it. To get the real Stanislavski, what Valery says about the same thing without with Meyerhold now. We killed Meyerhold first, then we canonized him now. And you know what's the best way of killing the artist? To canonize him.
That's right. That want to start some
Sure.
talk?
You know, today, George, and you should know, most actors do not say I'm a method actor anymore in this country, whether they're part of this nightmare or otherwise. They'll say that's part of a total approach to acting, the method. But we don't call ourselves method actors. And we've done many panels here with performers, and they deny what 20 years ago was I think when Marlon Brando was the personification of the American method. That's totally faded now, and people never say that they are method actors in this country. How about in Ireland?
In Ireland, I wouldn't have thought they say they're method actors. No, I mean, actually, I was thinking about the turn of the century being the most important sort of residual power that still dominates us, I mean, the turn of the 19th century. And Ellen Terry saying there are only three I's in acting, which is imagination, imagination, imagination. And actually, probably the same thing is true now, that any dominant philosophy, be it Meyerhold or Stanislavski, becomes corrupt in a minute because the moment changes. But very basic things do remain the same. Imagination, because in the imagination there is no politic. In the imagination, everything is possible. The unacceptable is acceptable. You explore the world in the imagination. And really, training could also hijack us into this notion of that training must be this or must be that. What is interesting about training is that the preoccupations, again, of each country come out in the training. And I think, just from what you said, that the interesting thing about Stanislavski being entirely hijacked by, and misplacedly hijacked in America, was the notion in America that you could do something exactly right if you could do the training exactly right. So if you could say, my conscious thought is this and my unconscious thought is that, when actually none of us know our unconscious thought. That is the point of it. You can only explode the moment and try and release meanings for others, not tell them the meanings in advance.
Yeah, that's true. Marita, you also mentioned something that which went by very quickly, but I wanted to bring it up when you say important issues.
Oh.
And, you know, and because this comes, I mean, as Fiona was saying, and both of, you know, our Russian friends mentioned too, obviously the training, well, the issues inform the training and perhaps vice versa. Tell us a little bit about that in Nordic theater, because I've known for years it's had a, well, you tell us.
Oh, that's a big one.
That's why I asked.
I think I have to go a little narrower here and go into the playwright I know best. Who is this? We call him now our new Strindberg, Lars Norén. He has been the most prolific and also probably the most important playwright in the Nordic countries for the last 30 years. But I know that we have a director that we both know, Björn Melander, who had to, in a way, come up with a new way of working on Norén's plays. I mean, to help the actors. So here we come in with how do you approach something that is written by a true original, and where really it's the tip of the iceberg that's the line, and everything else is somewhere else, and you have to find it. I think that, well, I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that for Björn, in the beginning, he had to write out the other thought. I'm not calling it but it is the unfinished thought that goes underneath the line that is being said. That helped the actors. They could use that if they wanted to, but they could also say, that's not what I want to work on here. But it was a way of helping to go deeper, to come up with the unique moment. And whether I think this comes to then the director and the relationship between director and playwright. And I am not sure that one can even call it a technique. It's a love affair, in a way. It is bringing a group of people together to start to believe and think in the same way, and then explore. Now we come to the other thing, and maybe Fiona, you know more about this, but it's a length of time to prepare. Swedish actors demand, I mean, if they have a, like your big role now, they would ask to know that they are doing it at least 6 months in advance, just to sit with it, to think about it, to let it sink down. The idea of getting a script and then rehearsing for 3 weeks, and then, I mean, it's unheard of.
Marita's making a very interesting point, I think, that goes beyond training, but goes into what's exciting about your writer, is that when a writer comes and just puts something there and nobody knows how to go near it, it's a very, very challenging and exciting moment, because too much of the theatre is about the history of the theatre. And a new thing needs a new method. And when I worked doing this Medea that I've been involved with here in Ireland, was that the Irish theatre had a group of actors entirely trained for Irish plays. They were not, all of them being the exception actually, but that they were not really, their imaginations were not geared towards an international imagination. And that's must be doubly interesting when in fact it's a local imagination that's just challenging the local performers. I think that must be terribly exciting, trying to find the way in, you know.
Yes.
And you're right about time. I mean, time is here, time is money. So I was at a conference in London recently where American actors were talking about the Shakespearean excitement of playing Shakespeare after just 3 weeks of responding to the text. Impossible to us in England.
Right.
I can't read it in 3 weeks.
Right.
But George,
exactly.
doesn't that open a discussion of what is the purpose of theater? I think if the purpose of theater is commercial, then you can understand why 3 to 6 weeks may be in rehearsal. But don't you think that there's a difference of purpose of the theater in each of the countries? In China, what is the purpose of theater?
Beyond the entertainment, which is the traditional. I know that in the plays of Cao Yu, which go back to the 1920s, I think he first wrote.
Yeah.
But things like Savage Land, which is quite an indictment then of the feudal system that existed in the 1920s. But now I know that the so-called, whether it's Western drama, since the 20s, I think China has the traditional and the new.
The more modern ones.
Yeah,
yes.
well, let's say modern. What would you say is the role, the purpose of that modern theater for your society today in China?
Okay, so it has to. We have to see it according to the historical background. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a revolution, so traditional theaters at the time, although they were educating and they were kind of recreational, but people found that they needed a kind of something which, like the German director said, will speak out and to shout, to voice their opinions. So they thought that they needed some kind of new forms of art, and they used that as. And I have to admit that we were strongly influenced by Russia, by Europe, and by America as well, in forming those new kind of theaters. Sometimes we label it as imported art forms, but not necessarily so. Now we take it for granted that we have a mixture of those different art forms, very diversified. So talking about nowadays, people think that still the tradition is very strong, still there. Say, for instance, we have like the Xiqu, it's a theater, more traditional theater form, which still has 365 or something kinds of those theaters, and they have 1,500 professional groups which can serve both as presenters, producers, or like the educators. They train trainers. They train their own students or actors or directors themselves. Each group can train those things. So they stick to their very traditional way of doing things. And also they have a traditional repertoire. This is very strong, probably still the strongest part of the theater.
And what role do you think, because of course Chinese, there's a great tradition of film in China as well, going way back to the silent days. But what would you say, if you were to sort of sum up the role beyond entertainment that the theater plays in China today for the Chinese society?
Yeah, so I wish to go on to say, even for those very traditional forms, they had a very important role to play, was to educate people. I mean the education is that time still many people were illiterate, and they wish to know the history. So say, for instance, for the Peking opera, which is very well known outside China, it has got a repertoire of 1,800 programs. Most of them were historical stories telling a particular period of time of the history. So that's to tell the younger generations what has happened in the past. So it was very strongly educational that time, and also recreational. But now I think more recreational than educational nowadays. But still the education is there, for not only for the traditional ones, as you mentioned, and also the modern ones.
Well, there's an education in terms of issues too, as I've seen in China.
You mean the social issues, or you mean
social issues,
whatever
yes.
the other issues?
Yeah, well, social issues, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Either social issues or some other issues as well. Tell the stories. Say, for instance, like once we put on the issue, The Death of a Salesman. It's an American play.
Yes.
Yeah. So for the Chinese audience, they wish to know what is happening in U.S. and what people are thinking about. You know, they want to know what is happening outside and what these people outside China they think and they live. You know, how they do that. So it's a kind of very interesting thing for them, and they get to. They have practiced the opening policy for 20 years now, and they are still going to do that.
I'd like to pick up on that, because I think that what I have sensed here in America is that the curiosity about the rest of the world may not be as great. Coming from small countries now, of course, we have to look outside. You come from a very big country, but there has to be a curiosity to go and see a foreign play. And well, if we are here, we have to be honest. There are very few foreign plays being produced in America. We know that, especially foreign plays from countries where they are written in a different language. They may come from Ireland or Australia or places where they write in English, but it's very hard to get something going from a foreign country. So I thought I'm happy to hear that there is curiosity about the rest of the world in China.
Well, I think that's good. That's true. the curiosity factor, and I think Elise, you can speak to that. The way you have been accepted in other countries, as opposed to you being an American, what we do here, because I know you've been literary manager at the American Place, and because you've been in that position, but the attitudes in American theater has been very different, I would think, you've run into than what you've...
I actually think you can probably talk about that very well. And some of the work that I've done is with George White and in bringing Americans to Russia and to work on all manner of exchanges, and it is usually such an eye-opening experience for the American actors to go and be a part of another culture, to see plays in another language, in Russian. In part because I think that there's not that much, I would agree, there's not that much kind of foreign material within American theater. That said, one of the programs that I've worked at starting at American Place is an educational program called Literature to Life that takes works of literature on the high school reading list of New York City public high schools and turns them into very simple adaptations, literary adaptations, but performed by wonderful actors. And that is opening American high school students up to see their curiosity for theater and for different texts. I mean, ranging from The House on Mango Street to Richard Wright's Black Boy, to, I mean, we have many different novels that have become theater, and they are some of the most curious American audiences, and discovering sort of literature that is generated in the United States. So there's a kind of cross-cultural excitement, I'd say, within the United States in certain sections of the theater, but it doesn't necessarily involve bringing international work here.
I think that's typical of America throughout all our areas. We impose our language and have been reluctant to learn other languages. I'm as guilty as anybody on that. And yet we expect others to accept our cultural contribution. Look what's happening in Russia, where now we're exporting, maybe you could address that, are exporting musicals to you. The Broadway musical, for example.
I have no chance to see your musical in Moscow, but it's Chicago there and 42nd Street every day. But it's not a real part of Russian culture, believe me. It's a kind of business idea to get money, which is Russia now about, like China. It's very interesting that in China, the educational purpose, which is part of any, I would say, strong ideological system, which we had and you had and still probably have more than Russia. Russia is in pieces now. But what comes after their great ideology? Because, you know, in the beginning of this century, we had a book written by a great Russian philosopher, Vasily Rozanov, entitled When the Bosses Are Gone, something like that. So the bosses are really gone, and what comes after their great ideology, great ideas, great utopias? You call it recreation theater. You know what, in 1919, during the Civil War, one of the founders of the Moscow Art Theater, Nemirovich Danchenko, his name, very difficult last name, two last names together, but very important man, believe me. Unknown here, but he is equal to Stanislavski because they both founders of the theater and 40 years of friendship and love and everything. So when they lost half of the company because one of 10, 12 best actors went to Europe, and it became clear that Moscow Art Theater cannot exist anymore. They started discussing, Stanislavski and Nemirovich, what should be staged now, what kind of repertoire. Stanislavski has an idea to stage great things immediately, Byron, you know, stuff and so on. Nemirovich, who was much more clever, not much more talented, it's different things, but real producer, he said, no, we should put on now an operetta. In 1919, in the middle of the war. And he said, look at the history of the world theater. Look at the history of the French Revolution and what they had after the Revolution. What left after the Revolution in France? Operetta. Because of what? People need an art of consolation now. Not of propaganda, but of consolation. This is the period which we experience now. It's not about entertainment only. It's a reaction to the great ideologies. It's a reaction to the great ideological system. This is a reaction to the great utopia, and all of that stuff people seek of. Entertainment, consolation in Chicago, 42nd Street, what have you, just get rid of ideology. Get rid of the political theater, by the way, also. No credentials. If you would come with some great political issues which you love here to Russia, nobody would come to see it. This is a paradox of freedom.
But is any of this, or isn't all of it, related to commerce? I mean, in this country, I think that our theater is directly related to commerce, and you don't sense that. They're bringing in, you're a bit dismissive, and I don't blame you, of bringing in 42nd Street or Chicago, but that's commerce, is it not?
You know, commerce, I saw a couple of days ago with my daughter Chicago movie.
Hmm?
Probably it's a commerce also, but it's a beautiful, beautiful movie with incredible acting, with incredible joy of life. Couple of days before Chicago, I saw a Russian movie in the Museum of Fine Arts with a very avant-garde Russian woman director, Kira Muratova, called The Chekhovian Motifs, which is so depressing. If you want to be depressed, go to see Russian movie. If you have not enough here, go to see Russian movie. And especially interesting when you see it together, the Chekhovian motifs of Kira Muratova and Chicago. Chicago is also not about the great life, prison, killings, all of that stuff. But what comes out of it? A great song.
Well, you know, there's nothing, commerce doesn't exclude art. I mean, Medea, which is a great success now, how could you get anything more artistic than that, and particularly in this presentation? It's commercial, but it's pure Greek theater performed by the Abbey Theatre. I think that's wonderful when you can mix art and commerce.
Yes, I'm not sure you can, actually. I think we've been very supported by some fantastic people, but I think there's a very interesting point that I'm just, as you speak, what happens when somewhere, a country that has an enormous ideology is then replaced by this entertainment for a moment? What happens their artistic future? Because one might worry that actually in America, after 1929 or whenever you think this 42nd Street culture of musicals really took off, the 40s and 50s and the 60s, we're still waiting for the big moment in American theatre. And I think actually we've been very lucky that Medea is a moment of tragedy in a city that is in the moment of tragedy. So actually you do need tragedy at the moment of terror as well as comedy.
If you're able to do it.
Yes.
If you have enough courage to do it.
Yes, but the audience do seem to want it too. It answers something about compassion, something about seeing suffering on a stage can make you feel better about the suffering in your life. However, that absolutely goes against your story, which is much more about Chicago being at least a big blast. Yeah.
Well, now, to continue, Fiona, for a minute, too, I was interested about all of it, and history, I think, obviously, again, informs our theater. And let's talk a little bit about the Abbey and its history. I mean, in a sense, when you think of people like Lady Gregory and Yeats and all these people that were political animals, God knows, Maud Gunn, all of those people. And the Abbey had a very strong, wouldn't you say, political bent then. Then what happened? Maybe and then what happened since, you know?
Yes,
that.
I mean the Abbey, very like the Moscow Art Theatre, and
Exactly.
you know, and probably, I don't know, but probably the Peking Opera have been trading on a kind of success of a moment that is long turned into another moment. And this is the dangerous thing, that actually all our cultures are retrospective. That we praise what we already know, not really the new. It's much harder to see the new than to, you know, praise something in the past. So you're right. In a way, the Abbey dangerously became a conservative symbol of Ireland because it became institutionalised. It is always a problem for the theatre. It should always have an element of the renegade. It should always have an element of the person off the edge. It should always have the writer who writes the impossible play. As soon as things become institutionalized, it becomes the establishment, and the establishment is not where the future lies.
I think the Abbey did go through a kind of a rough time as being literally sort of rather dusty, and that's changed. But what changed it?
I think it's just changing now. I think what's changed it is that I was very interested that the Chinese audience still go to be educated. I think what's happened in Ireland is people can see the movie of Chicago, and the theatre has to be terribly competitive now and has to answer people's lives, which are much broader than they were. I think quite simply people are seeing things beyond their country boundaries, and so they need a theatre to respond to that kind of experience.
Well, also in the last 10 years, Ireland has changed a great deal, too.
Ireland has become, you know, America. In 10 years, everybody's almost got American accents there now. It's incredible. People are putting in cigars. But I think the very interesting point said earlier about, I wish we could all see more of other people's theatre. I wish American plays would come to Ireland more frequently, Swedish plays come to Ireland, and vice versa, because who is the great presenter in this country of that, or in this landmass of this, is Robert Lepage, who now produces pieces of theatre that have both French titles or subtitles, and so you have a bit of Canada and a bit of often a bit of Japanese and a bit of Chinese, all thrown into the same evening, and you feel that you're plugged into you're plugged into a much more international culture. It's very exciting.
Well, now, I want to add something.
Please.
I think that we should not say that the Chinese is a kind of one very simple idea, and the Chinese people need to be, say, kind of politically or educated, something like that. I don't think that's a correct vision. China is so big, with the population so large, so any kind of people can live there. And so some people would love to have very traditional ones. Some people love to be educated. Some people would love to have very open-minded. Some people love to travel a lot and to have a kind of, as I mentioned, imported art forms or whatever. They wish to do the exchanges. Some people rather, stick to the traditions. So it's a kind of a very mixtured picture. And we are very pleased to have this kind of diverse. So we say, we have a kind of, what is label or slogan, is called, let 100 flowers bloom. It's say, whatever the flower, well, you bloom just. So this is, I think, it's a more correct picture of China is now. It's so big and diverse.
And the diversity is, for instance, is there as much diversity in theater, let us say, in the provinces like in Xi'an or out in Chongqing or places like that as there are, let's say, in Shanghai or Beijing or places like that?
Yeah, in the cities like Beijing, Shanghai, they have more exposures to the outside, so they have much more diverse culture than, say, in cities, which still have something, but not as many as in the coastal areas. Yeah.
Well, now,
and also, as you mentioned, that since 1970s or 80s, there is a big change, a shift. So further away to a more diverse, more open culture. And we are proud of that.
Yes, indeed.
And so, say for instance, not long ago we have many study groups coming to the United States to study the musicals, as Mr. Ramrai met them. And it is not that they wish to use the musicals to replace the traditional plays, but they just want to have more art forms to, they say, to entertain the audience. And also we have another problem which existed is a kind of related to market. Nowadays, because of the market economy, so we have a kind of difficulties to overcome. Is not as a political problems or this kind of difficulty, but the difficulty that how those artists or performing arts themselves, the theaters, can survive in the market. Yeah. Different kinds of things. They have the same problem.
So of course, also in China, you're training. I mean, from beyond the traditional. I guess up until 1949, many Chinese theater actors and directors came to the United States and learned at the Yale School of Drama. And between 1949, let's say, and 1956, at the Stanislavski Institute.
Lots of them.
Yes, and then subsequently, the Theater Academy in Beijing was training out of both those traditions in the, if you will, the less traditional dramas, which is interesting that those kind of influences, the Western training, have pervade in the standard drama in China today. I think that continues. Is that true?
Nowadays, we have more influences from different directions.
Right, right. Good.
Early on, Marita made some mention of something that I'd love to hear everybody talk about. She spoke of the training of audiences and how you bring young people into the theater. I'm assuming that's commercial theater.
Well, I think we can go back to the late 50s when Ingmar Bergman came and became the director of the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm and said, where are we going to get our audiences from? To see the, well, call it the important drama, not to sort of have them just go to Chicago, the movie, or but that they would have this desire to go and see live drama. And he started to work with the school systems in Stockholm. And then I think it spread. Many of the major theaters around the country invited, first of all, they invited, of course, the school children to come in there, but they invited the artists to write for them. And that was so extraordinary. We have a remarkable, I mean, and this is not just Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Iceland, a remarkable repertory of plays for young children dealing with all the, you know, life when you lose the death of a parent, divorce, all of the issues that they would be interested in, and there they are, and they are enjoying it. And I think it's important for many reasons. They get something from what they are seeing, but they also get inspired to continue to come to the theater.
We're going to take a quick pause and come back to that, because I want to find out, pick up on that in Russia. Elise, is your experience in different cultures all around. That's a very important one. We're going to take a pause, come back, answer some questions, and we'll be back in a minute.
Before we get back to the American Theatre Wing's Working in the Theatre seminar on world theatre, I'd like to remind you that these seminars are only one of the many year-round programs that the American Theatre Wing undertakes. You're probably familiar with the American Theatre Wing's Tony Award, which are given out for excellence in the Broadway theatre. We also have an important grants program providing aid to off and off-Broadway theaters, as well as a scholarship program that assists promising students to pursue studies in the theater arts. As a long-established charity dating back to World War I and World War II and our famous Stage Door Canteen, all of our programs are designed to reward and promote excellence in the theater, to introduce young people and their families to the theater and the magic it unfolds. We take pride in the work we do and remain grateful to all our members and everyone whose contributions help make possible the dynamic programs of the American theater. We're pleased to be a part of this exciting industry. And now, let's get back to that wonderful panel on world theater, and now our moderator, George White.
Thank you, Roy. I want to pick up where we left off about training audiences, which, of course, is the future of all our theaters, obviously, the live theater. And Marita, you talked about Sweden. Fiona, what do you know about how is it done in Ireland and England or Australia? Are you up on that? How do you bring young people into the theatre?
It's a very interesting phenomenon, because you don't want to train them to, people don't want to feel that they're being coerced into anything. But I do think that when you mentioned earlier film, this great film, Chicago, that everybody's excited about, or indeed the great musicals, that they are training audiences to enjoy watching a story that unfolds, that always ends happily, and that always has certain emotional buttons that press the audience and they react accordingly. Now, you could be training the audience to go on going to musicals, or you could be saying we need to train audiences to go to the theatre with a much more morally fluid eye, so that they decide what they watch on the theatre. They do not have their buttons pressed, but they choose where the buttons are being pressed in their own lives. And so I do think there's two different types of audiences at the moment. The movies have absolutely taken the audience, because they've, with great aplomb, sledgehammered our imaginations into watching these giant dreamscapes. And the musicals in part do the same. They use very powerful sound, music which is so basic and atavistic in our systems. But the theatre I think we're talking about, which is the theatre about this element of cultural preoccupation, is a much more delicate animal to train audiences towards in a time when we all work too hard, and so we want a bit of leisure in our leisure time. We have to want to know more than we already know. We have to want to ask questions about whether we're right to feel happy or unhappy, or whether our unhappiness has any other reply in the universe. And these are questions that we're being, by governments actually, orientated away from. We're asking ourselves only, do you feel okay? Have you got enough money in your pocket? Have a good time. But in fact, of course, there are all sorts of odd areas around the edges of our existence that need to be replied to, and the theatre is a wonderful place for replying to them. But we have to want to go. So I don't know how we train except to take children and make children go, and so they have a habit. We're a habit forming.
Indeed. Well, of course, and I pick up on what Anatoly said too about Stanislavski and saying spiritual, because in many ways, and this may not be true, or may, I don't know, in China, but so much of our theatre over the years has grown out of the church, going way back to medieval times for fulfilling a particular kind of spiritual function, perhaps.
Yes, well, I mean, or the Greeks who went to the theatre to find out what they really meant by anything. What do they mean by the gods? What do they mean by right and wrong? What do they mean by punishment? These are very... They weren't going with any... I'm sure they went and had a great time, but they went to see stories from which they could conclude moral values.
Well, Medea.
Medea, absolutely, is about, you know, whether you can judge people, or whether in a pre-judging, pre-Christian world, you're not really judging, you're just accepting what the person does and sees them take the consequence of action. And, you know, we've been very much hijacked by a leisure culture that really doesn't ask us to do that in the theatre very much now. Or we find it gloomy when we are asked to do it. It needn't be gloomy, of course. It could be terribly exciting. But we have to want to go there with a mental muscle. And I'm sure that's the same in China or Sweden or Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, picking up on what you're saying about it connecting to a young person's life, I think there has to be ways in which the theatre speaks to them. So I was interested in what you're saying, that there is a literature developed for young audiences. In this program, Literature to Life, that I've been working on, we are, in a sense, developing through, not through dramatic, you know, asking playwrights, but through pulling from novels, but a literature that is speaking directly to an audience of young people. And it's amazing, because you would think that this is stripped down, very little set, minimal light, that an audience of high school students would not be silent and attentive to basically a monologue or a dialogue for a period of over an hour. And they are rapt. They are still and rapt if it's coming from a very truthful place in the actors. And it's one of the most challenging audiences to work for, because they will immediately sense the iota of falseness, and a Walkman has gone back on, or, you know, there's distraction in the room. But if you are telling a story that is very connected to life, and you're doing it in an honest way, it's very, very powerful. So I have tremendous optimism about young audiences, but one has to be dedicated, and there are lots of arts, various different forms of arts in education programs in the United States, which I think are probably some of the most exciting theater that's happening. But you have to be very, very dedicated to bringing audiences, or bringing these pieces out into schools. So.
Okay, that's true. Valery.
Да, наверное.
Конечно, я знаю. About the Meyerhold Center, what is your approach to younger audience or training your young people in Meyerhold Center, and in general, and maybe tell you too, but particularly how your approach is, because you're doing so much at the Meyerhold Center.
Дело в том, что мы сейчас работаем в замечательном здании уже 2 года.
We're working in a new, wonderful building in the past 2 years.
сцена, которая, мне кажется, по техническим возможностям просто первая в Москве.
It's one of the in terms of its scenic possibilities, one of the best stages in Moscow.
В какой-то степени это идея Мейерхольда.
It's an idea based on an idea of Meyerhold's.
Она находится на 6-м этаже сцены.
It's located on the 6th floor.
И пол может опускаться вниз на 5-й этаж, таким образом выстраивать любое пространство.
And the floor can sink down to the 5th floor. So you can create any theatrical space.
А часть потолка может открыться.
And part of the roof can open.
И можно начать спектакль при дневном свете и перейти на электричество.
And you can start the production in daylight and then go into electrical light.
Но это не театр, это центр, театрально-культурный центр.
It's a cultural center.
И поэтому мы работаем по разным направлениям.
And so we're working in many different directions simultaneously.
Прежде всего, самая главная задача — это работа с молодыми режиссерами.
Our first among those is our work with young directors.
Дать им возможность, дать им шанс для того, чтобы они и учились, и попробовали себя, заявить о себе.
To study and then to sort of give birth within themselves to their directing visions.
В этом году мы набрали высшие курсы вместе с МХАТом, со школой-студией МХАТ.
So this year we took a graduate course in conjunction with the Moscow Art Theatre School.
Таким образом, как бы соединили уже Станиславского и Мейерхольда.
So we're uniting Stanislavski and Meyerhold.
Кроме этого, мы проводим гастроли, фестивали, делаем спектакли.
So we also conduct tours and festivals, lectures, also productions, master classes.
У нас очень много молодежи.
So we have a lot of young people.
Главная аудитория — это молодые.
And I'd say the bulk of our auditorium is young people.
Я думаю, что дело не в том, что они хотят учиться, им это интересно.
It's not just that they want to study and it's interesting.
Но все-таки, мне кажется, надо противостоять развлечению, противостоять коммерческому театру.
But you have to stand in opposition to commercial theater and to pure entertainment.
Это очень тяжело.
And that's hard.
Но надо это делать.
But you have to do it.
Потому что нужно отстаивать эти рубежи изо всех сил.
So you have to stand up with these boundaries, рубежи.
How do you do that? Yeah. How do you do that?
With all your strength. Как?
Очень просто. Для меня, например, очень просто.
It's very simple for me.
Не важно.
Нет, молодые люди всегда интересуются чем-то. В России вообще все равно существует, как бы и не говорил Анатолий, о любви к мюзиклам у некоторой части населения.
In Russia there is a love for musicals in a portion of
сегодня.
Today in a portion of the population.
Но в России очень сильная театральная традиция.
But in Russia there's a very deep, strong theater tradition.
Очень сильная традиция.
Very strong.
И поэтому все равно театры переполнены.
And the theaters are full.
Это тоже плохо.
And that's
also
bad.
Потому что уже критерии непонятны, потому что когда люди идут на все.
Are unintelligible because people will go to anything.
Так тоже не может быть.
That's
так
also
тоже не может быть. Вообще идеал всегда посередине.
The ideal is somewhere in the middle.
Потому что это тоже перекос.
It's a wonderful problem to have, isn't it?
Очень хорошая проблема.
Это так кажется, что
It seems that way.
Это так кажется, но на самом деле она тоже очень сложная проблема.
It's a very complicated problem.
Когда люди говорят, что это хорошо.
Everyone says, yes, it's
это
wonderful,
хорошо.
It's great.
Так сказать, все хорошо.
Everything's great.
А ты понимаешь, что это ужасно.
And you know that it's awful.
Это надо закрыть и забыть.
You have to close it and forget it.
А говорят, хорошо, смотрите, и газеты написали.
And the papers are saying it's wonderful.
Вообще все хорошо.
But maybe it is wonderful. Perhaps it is wonderful.
Возможно, это на самом деле и хорошо.
Ну, возможно, для них и хорошо, но для меня плохо, потому что...
It's maybe for them it's good, but for me it's not.
Я думаю, что воспитание зрителя молодого.
I think educating a young audience
начинается все-таки с того, чтобы его заинтересовать,
is to interest them,
но заинтересовать не подлаживаясь под него,
not sort of looking down to them, or
не пытаясь его развлечь,
and not to entertain,
а пытаясь все-таки говорить с ним о серьезных вещах.
but to talk about serious things.
Потому что любой человек все равно,
Any person,
молодой, не молодой,
Young, old.
если он не идиот, он чувствует себя одиноким, он хочет любви, он боится
if he's not an
смерти.
idiot, feels that he's alone, he's scared of
не
death,
идиот.
he's,
Это нормально. И
It's normal.
через это надо к нему
and through
подходить.
that, you have to go. And
Хотя я думаю, что на книжной полке могут стоять разные книги,
but there are many different books on the bookshelf.
в том числе и Чикаго.
Chicago can be there too.
I'm in charge of Chicago. To answer the same question, you know, I have very probably strange experience of my life because I spent 8 years of my life in the beginning of my theatrical life in the theater for the youth, because as you know, in the Soviet Union we had a special system of the theater, like China, they imitated us. Every big city theater for the youth, because strong propaganda, ideology, you have to teach people, you have to educate people. And when I hear to educate people, I immediately, you know, like that, because I hate it. I hated, I had experience with that, 8 years, when they brought to the theater of the youth. If they are kids like 7, 8 years that time, it's okay, because they are ready for everything. You know, fairy tale and so on. But when they teenagers, which is the most important time, because as a teenager, I don't believe, I don't trust, I would like to touch myself, I would like to know, and so on. Try to convince that audience with the communist ideology, with the capitalist. They want to know. And in the Soviet time, what was it? You know, they brought audience of homogeneous, you know, strata, age, from 12 to 15. And they obliged us in a theater to do a special production for the young children, for the teenagers, and so on and so on. And we did it for many, many years. And I hate it because, you know what, when you have audience from 12 to 15 and you want to educate them, it's a hell. They hate you. And every performance was a battle between stage and audience. And the same thing I had another horrible and beautiful experience. I was working 5 years for the theater, the biggest Russian Soviet theater, theater of the Soviet Army. 2,000 people, the biggest audience. It's constructed under Stalin, the tanks and, you know, everything on stage. Battles of 400 people and so on, a Soviet army, great you talk. Very often they brought soldiers, 2,000 soldiers, try to educate them, beautiful people, peasants, you know, from now soldiers. And what they did in the great educational period, that's my point, they brought 2,000 soldiers to the theater of the Soviet army with 99 columns, where you are immediately miserable, and you have to feel miserable against the 99, you know, ancient Greek columns. By the way, Greek also were wrong. When they, you know, Greek theater, educational stuff, moral, yes. They did not allow slaves to be there. They did not allow women to be there. So it's not, you know, just ideal theater. Did not allow half of the nation to be there. Okay, I love Greek theater, and I'm going to see the Medea today with Valery. Because I really... So what happened, they brought 2,000 soldiers, and they told them, guys, behave well in a theater. Yeah. Don't, you know, make noise. Don't, you know, laugh. Yeah. Don't, you know, be angry. In 5 minutes, 1,800 of them were sleeping. And the other 200 were coughing because soldiers are very had a flu. They every time ever have a flu, and they are coughing. And the guys of the military rank, you know, a little bit higher, they were walking into the in the aisle, saying, "Stop coughing." That's the education, you know. And after that, I hate even the word of education in the theater because life is the great educator. They are coming to the theater with on the show. You know, when Moscow Art Theater started, from what point? They did ask the actors, from where you're coming on stage? And they did say, from the wings. From the wings. The answer was, no, you should come from life. With the burden on your shoulders. That's the real theater starts. And that's the whole education. If you bring real life, moments of a real, you know, stuff, spontaneous courage and all, that's theater. Because I gave you a quote of, you know, 1919, the same quote from Stanislavski. He was teaching at the Bolshoi Theater in 1920 and for the singers. And one of them, she wrote down all of his stuff, and it was published. It's a very strange question was among the young singers of the Bolshoi Theater to Stanislavski. If we would ask you to give just few words about what is the ideal theater for you, just few words, a sentence. And after a pause, he says, I will give you 4 words what is the real theater for me after half of a century of experience. Those 4 words. Simpler, higher, lighter, and more joyful. You understand? It doesn't look like Stanislavski, but this is a combination of a great thing. Simpler. That's the education. Lighter at the same time. And more joyful. That's about Chicago.
I didn't really mean to get into such an esoteric discussion. What I was simply wondering is, the American Theater Wing does a lot to educate and expand audiences as best we can. But I was looking at it from a commercial point of view. I'm wondering, today our ticket prices are as high as $100 in New York City, and nearly that around the country. That by itself seems to exclude the young people who don't even pay that much for rock concerts, and the elderly people, or people who are older who are on fixed incomes. They're excluded from being able to go to the theater regularly, as they used to do. And I'm wondering what's that like around the country? It costs us now, I think the analogy is 10 times, you can see 10 films for the cost of going to a Broadway show. And the ratio is a little less as you go out of the city or into off-Broadway and off-Broadway. Those same people want to go to the theater. They've been educated one way or the other as one of your people, but they can't afford to do it in this country. It's a big problem for us. I'm wondering how that works around the world. Do we have the same problems elsewhere in the commercial?
Yeah, that's a good point. What is the cost in China, for instance, of a ticket in Beijing?
It depends. It depends on what kind of shows.
Well, let's say a traditional drama.
Traditional drama tend to be, say, 50 yuan.
Which
it's
would be
divided by 8. That would be $1 equals 8 Chinese yuan. So
and regular drama.
Right.
Western drama.
About approximately the same price, from 50 to say 200. That's the normal price. But for good shows, there will be $2,000 even, like 3 tenors last year, like the Turandot, 19.
How much
in
China for Turandot?
For Turandot, the most expensive seat costed 2,000 yuan. $2,000 US dollars.
What?
U.S.?
US. Yes.
2,000?
Oh yeah.
And you get it? People buy that?
Probably not many Chinese because afford
please.
Businessmen from other
$2,000
places.
for a ticket?
Yes.
$2,000
I mean, that's the
dollars?
extreme. That's the
Extreme.
most expensive
$1 to
block
$2,000.
of the seats. I mean,
Unbelievable.
yeah. I would just give you some idea that how varied the tickets can be.
Sure.
Yeah, it can be just a few dollars. It can be just a few $1,000. So it depends on what kind of shows. The same problem existed in China as well, like how to draw the audience back to the theaters. I agree with most of you. It's a globalization problem, I think, that with the TV, with the movie to compete with the theaters.
Well, what about Sweden? Don't you have a reasonable price? I mean, like the dollar bill.
Yes, I would say that we can. Much of the theater is subsidized, so therefore the tickets are reasonably. But we can also go and see what we would call Broadway theaters. Many of those exist as well, but I'm sure that for young audiences, you have group sales. They arrange for them to come into the theaters. The municipal theater in Stockholm is really caters to groups of young people coming in there. And
What's the equivalent cost, let's say, in dollars, roughly?
I would say for $5 you would see a good play.
In a film?
A serious
And how much would a film be?
Oh, I think it's about the same. It could be more.
Films could be more expensive
more,
than
yes.
to a play.
Yes.
In all the Nordic countries?
I'm more familiar now with Sweden than the others, but I think so. Of course, everything is so different. I think the little Nordic countries, they have established a whole other way, I think, of looking at theater and film and so on. And they have a huge, let's take Iceland. I don't know how many amateur theater companies there are. It's just part of being, to be part of theater, to seek it out, to be then be on stage, but also to seek it out and go. Finland with all its music, with all its opera. I mean, it just is part of the psyche in a way. And I would say Sweden, Norway, Denmark, people go to the theater. That's part of their life, I think. Like
well, in so many societies abroad, theater would be the equivalent in the United States of sports.
Yes.
Sporting events. People go, they don't spend as much, although,
Right.
but that's just part of life and part of the society. It's built into the fabric of the society, not special. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. That's how I feel. At least that's my experience. Now maybe I'm glamorizing a little bit because I've been away so long, but I hope I'm right here, and that it hasn't totally turned.
Well, I think also, I know in Russia, for instance, although the Russian Chicago, I know, was up to with...
Why you did mention Chicago?
No, but I'm talking about the you know, I know that that was $200 US to go to that show, but also you have two prices in Russia too. You have tourist prices for the Bolshoi, and I don't know whether it's true.
They eliminated it now. It's one price for everyone, and they are getting big income now. The Bolshoi Theatre, they are getting $75,000 for the ballet, the Lebedine Ozero, the Swan Lake, and because the prices are now the same for foreigners, and it's a state-subsidized theater, by the way.
But they're getting $75 now a ticket. When did this go out of business? It's changed.
Yes, they changed the management of Bolshoi Theatre, and they started selling the box office real prices because it was actually black market. A lot of scalpers around Bolshoi selling, $75, $100, but real price was $5. So, and the profit went to the management of Bolshoi Theatre, mostly.
What about Moscow Art? What about the Moscow Art?
Moscow Art.
Do you have two price structures there, or just one?
No, no. Now it's also new policy because we have new artistic director. You know him very well, Oleg Tabakov. He's a great comedian actor, and he doesn't like any empty space there. When he see one seat empty, he became angry because he's comedian. What is one seat is there, empty. And we have some shows which are very commercial, and the admission is very high, $100, which is unbelievable in Russia. Even in Stanislavski's time, Moscow Art Theatre was the most expensive theater in the country, you should know. It was a private theater without any state subsidy. And it was very, very high admission. That's why they changed the name of the theater. As you know, probably they started as Moscow Art Accessible for the audience theater, and then they cut accessible. You should understand it. Moscow Art Theatre is a logo, but it was Moscow Art Accessible. So, and I would say now it's also not Moscow Art Theatre very accessible, but some of the things are very cheap. The point is, this is the politics. This is the things where the city and the country should be involved really, not in education, but in a regulation of, look, all of the theater buildings in Moscow, mostly 99%, are state property. And that's why the tickets could be cheap, quite cheap, because they don't pay rent.
I'm sorry, but you know, airtime is also expensive, and I'm afraid we're going to have to bring this to a close. I really want to thank George White for his moderating this wonderful, wonderful talented panel that we have here today. We appreciate your sharing your knowledge with us and your experience. And just to let you know that we'd love to have you back very soon. This has been an American Theatre Wing seminar on working in the theater, coming to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Thank you.
Спасибо.